Dear friends, it's my honor to be part of this tribute for Audrey Frank. She was really a magnificent woman, magnificent person. To herself, she was rather modest and quiet. And I don't mean she certainly spoke and shared, but had a quiet demeanor and a powerful impact on her family. Families asked me to share the traditional "The Lord is my shepherd," a favorite psalm of Audrey's. Mizmor David, Adonai ro'eh lo echsar beno atesh yarbitzeni. Al mei menuchot yanahaleni, nafshi yeshovev, yancheni v'maglei tzedek leman shemo. The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He guides me on paths of righteousness, and he revives my soul for the sake of his glory. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your staff and your rod, they comfort me. You set a table before me in the sight of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil. My cup, the cup of life, overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall abide in the house of the Lord forever. Audrey Frank had to be the most marvelous person, loving and welcoming to the spouses of her children, and yet being a powerful voice, a powerful force for all of you. She had liberal ideas, something that I find very appealing. But she also wanted to learn about each one of you. She had an endless curiosity and a drive to know people, to discuss world affairs, a thirst for knowledge. And she, as you've shared with me, was truly a blessing to each one of you. Audrey was the youngest of 3 daughters born to Francis and Martin Weiss. We're fortunate that Aunt Esther, an older sister, is with us. And Esther, you are welcome, and may God give you continued long life. Audrey combined elements that we associate with being the ideal mother, the loving mother, wonderful cook, meticulous housekeeper, overflowing love for children and grandchildren, all the qualities that we associate with a traditional mother. But she also had qualities that were unusual. Loved current events, read the newspapers, devoured the news, a thirst for liberal ideals, which she lived by, which she stood by, liberal beliefs and liberal positions, a thirst for world affairs, a readiness to read the great works of literature. This was unusual for a woman of her generation, especially a girl from a family of modest means who placed marriage and family ahead of college. She was one of so many who, after high school, was directed towards ultimately finding a husband. Audrey was deeply respected and loved at Montefiore, where I serve as chaplain. For 30 years, she really was a vital volunteer. She would impress each of us, and certainly impress me, as a very thoughtful, considerate person. She had the personality, if you would, of a teacher or a librarian. There was that considerateness and thoughtfulness in the way she answered. And in truth, many people came to Audrey to seek out her counsel. She was warm and caring and helped many along their path. She was a very dynamic leader of our auxiliary in the years when our auxiliary was really a flagship organization. She was president at least twice of our auxiliary, and served on our board of directors. So she had many distinctions. She led a not-to-be-missed current events group every Thursday morning. And I've heard from people who worked with her and participated with her how vital that Thursday morning current events group was. She was loved at Montefiore. I spoke to friends, close friends like Shirley Bash, Alice Sayer, another dear friend, shared with me, and again, Alice is retired and gone to live comfortably nearby. And Alice shared how precious their friendship was, and how in many ways she followed Audrey, learned from Audrey how to be a president of the auxiliary. And she said to me, they were literally next-door neighbors, that she felt safe living on that street, even when she was alone, because Audrey was nearby. Each of you shared vitally about the influences and gifts of your mother, your mother-in-law, your grandmother. She had an incredible love for Tibby, her late husband, who passed away almost 14 years ago. The two modeled as strong a marital bond as can be imagined. And Audrey once said with feeling, "My husband is the most important part of my life." What a beautiful statement. My husband, and Tibby worked endless hours at his work. My husband is the most important part of my life. Each of the grandchildren shared warmly and sensitively. Elise, you shared how you're the daughter to, Wendy and Tom. Did I get that? Okay. You shared how warm your memories are as a little girl. How often your grandma came to different events, different plays and presentations. How you really valued sleeping over at Grandma's house, and how she tucked you in and made you feel protected. Mimi, I hope you're here. Mimi, okay. Several of the grandchildren had to travel enormous distances, and we appreciate each of you. Mimi, you also shared a host of feelings. The board games that were such an important part of the family's relaxation, and which Audrey kept meticulously. Not a piece was missing. The constant trips to bring you into the world of art and museums and to enlarge your vistas and impart so much culture. And lastly, she had to know, Mimi, how soon, how long will it be till you're coming back? Ellen, Bob's dear wife, you shared how she welcomed you as Bob's wife. How, thank God, you were a Democrat and could be accepted into the family wholeheartedly. And how your entire family adored Audrey. And you shared with us Audrey's special kindness in sharing that terrible bit of news at a difficult time. How she brought news, but also comfort. Wendy, you shared how much you'd miss her smile. That Audrey shared a zest and joy in life, a love of life, and that she was a joyful person. And she taught so much to her daughters-in-law and her daughter. How to be a wife, how to cook, how to entertain company, how to make fantastic baked goods and so on. Showing us how to do things, and how she excelled as a teacher just by a friendly and loving example. Each of you shared very vitally, and several are going to share after me. Joe, I'm not going to test my memory anymore, but Carolyn and Paul's son. Joe, you shared so nicely, and you told how you felt showered with love, and how fun and fulfilling it was to be near Audrey, to be around her. And you credited her readiness to stand up, not just to have liberal or other ideals. She stood up for what she believed in. Paul, Carolyn's husband, you shared how welcoming she was to you. And she managed to have your favorite baked goods always nearby. But she also had a sincere interest. What's going on? What's happening with you? What are you doing? She really had a great curiosity to know about her family. And if she didn't know someone so well, she sought you out to learn more, to be an immediate presence. In sum, the hour and a half that I spent with you, or a little over an hour, was so meaningful and so powerful. We can say easily, Audrey lived her ideals and gave love without limit. I'd like to call on daughter Carolyn, Dr. Carolyn Sachs, to please come up.
I'm going to speak briefly, really just about my mom as a mom, because she really was the ideal mom. I want to start, though, first just by thanking my brothers, Bob and Tom, because I couldn't be here all the time. And I really think that they did an incredible job taking care of her. So I want to thank them for that. And I want to thank my sister-in-laws, Wendy and Ellen, and also Elise, who really were there for her when I couldn't be in the end. So my mother was the perfect mother. My children often don't believe just how incredibly ideal she was in her mom role. I don't think are really any moms quite like her anymore. In our household, dinner was cooked from scratch every night. Dinner wasn't just a bowl of pasta, which is what it usually was in my house, but it was a main course, a side dish, a salad, and some kind of homemade dessert. We never had dinner without dessert. Even lunches were prepared fresh every day. I actually would get on a school bus and ride the bus home, and my mother would have the table set and a hot lunch for me, and she'd sit down with me and we'd eat lunch together, and then I would ride the school bus back to school. Everybody who knows my mom knows that she kept an absolutely perfect house that was meticulously clean. Every morning the beds were made, and in my house that meant a bedspread was put on the bed. I don't actually know anyone who has a bedspread anymore, but every bed was made with a bedspread. Everything was clean, not just the parts of the house that you could see. So the moldings were dusted, the light fixtures were dusted. Clean didn't mean that it looked clean. Clean really meant that it was clean. My mother read to me every single night before I went to bed. And there may be people who think, oh, my mother read to me too. But my mother read to me every single night before bed through the 7th grade. She read every Louisa May Alcott book that was ever written to me. Slow, long books. And it was really a wonderful experience to share with her. Sometimes I would meet people and they would talk about how they had a dysfunctional home, and I would always think there was nothing dysfunctional about my home. My home ran perfectly smoothly because my mother really was the ideal mom. In addition to being a great cook and housekeeper, she had this very special kind of intelligence, and it was very different from my father's intelligence because I never went to my mom with my math or my physics homework. But my mother had the most incredible emotional and social intelligence. She just understood people, and people would confide in her. So my experience of growing up, so often a teenager was sitting at our kitchen table pouring their heart out to her, telling her their personal stories. I never really understood why they were telling her all their deepest secrets, but I think it was because they trusted her and they really respected her counsel. She also just set this example of amazing friendships. She loved her friends, and I think her friends loved her. And she had so many good friends. It seemed like if she was ever someone's friend, they were her friend for life. So in our neighborhood, from Akron, from Montefiore, she just had made so many friendships. And even as she got older and she didn't necessarily remember all of everybody's name, she always greeted people with just beautiful social grace and a beautiful smile, which I really admired. So I feel so incredibly lucky that I had the ideal mom. I always felt like her love for me was boundless. I knew it was boundless for me, for my brothers, for my father, for our cat, Quentin, for her sisters, for her grandchildren, nieces, and nephews. So I just really wanted to affirm here that I really did have the perfect mom.
Dr. Tom Frank.
Well, when it was time to think about what I would say about my mother, I thought I would really talk about her legacy and how I feel I am her legacy, and how my mother was truly my moral compass. So how did she get the way she was? Her worldview was shaped by some really incredibly major events. She grew up during the Depression in a family that was not well-to-do at all. And that taught her to be truly frugal and yet value education. On top of the Depression, when she was in 9th grade, her father died, leaving her mother a seamstress with 3 young girls. And that really was a huge thing for my mother. the value, the importance of working hard and supporting their mother. My mother worshipped her mother. I mean, that, aside from my father, that was the most important person in the world for her. And she really taught me how important it is to value my parents, my in-laws, because my mother would wax on endlessly about her brothers-in-law, her brother-in-law Maury and Milton, and how nice they were to her mother. And I take that value at heart when I think about my mother-in-law and what an important part of my life she is. My mother thought about how important it is to empower women in general, though. And I think that led to, later on, my feelings about many things. Equal rights for women, the ability to women go out and support themselves, even though she chose in her life that her role would be to support my father so that he could work 7 days a week and do that so that he could send his 3 kids to private colleges and 2 of his kids to private medical schools. We were so fortunate. My mother also lived through the Holocaust. Although I think as a teenager and a high school girl while this was going on, most Americans didn't really know exactly what was going on, but afterwards there was that sense of guilt that she had survived, her family here had survived only because of the foresight of her mother and her father and my father's mother and father to come to America, but that relatives in Europe, most weren't there anymore. But that became a very important thing in the way she thought of the world and the importance of having a safe place for the Jewish homeland and Zionism. My mother was quite an intellectual. She would have loved to have gone to 4 years of college. She did go to 1 year of college, and she told us over and over again, she went to a year of college because her sister paid her tuition. Her sister Esther, her older sister, who's still here today. And how thankful she was her entire life of that. My mother was a current events fanatic. Most families, they'll discuss things a little, but this was truly our dinner table discussion every day. We would have little debates, and those of you know how I like to debate issues, so that comes straight from my mom. I mean, we would sit, we would debate issues. We got 2 newspapers a day until tragically Cleveland went down to 1 newspaper a day, and we read them cover to cover every day. So my mom was really a teacher in the true Socratic style. She didn't lecture us all that much. I mean, occasionally she did. But she involved us in that Socratic form of discussion such that she didn't tell us how to feel, but she led us to feel the way I think she would approve of. She also lived through the Vietnam War, which to my kids is a historical event, but to my cousins who were older than me and my brother, this was a huge event in our lives. I mean, for a number of years, there was this terrible fear that her son would be sent off and might meet the same fate as my father's brother did in World War II. And that was a really major thing that really formed, my worldview, this senseless killing and thought of fighting unnecessary wars. So my mother's biggest value that she wanted to impart to me, I think, is be a mensch. I mean, that's what she would say over and over again. So those that aren't Jewish, that means be a man. And be a man and support the values that she told us. So things like the importance of men in women's lives and the importance of how males should treat their families. Patients often ask me, Dr. Frank, why did you decide to become an obstetrician gynecologist? And the short answer was, well, that's what my mom told me to do. She never really told me to do that. But, my whole life, I think she was preparing me for that role. This is what I think. She would say, I think you would be really good at that. This is why this is a really important thing to do. So when I go to work, I think, I think of my mom and I think of what we do. I see a couple of my colleagues here. It's really, truly important. So my mom is gone, but her values will live on. I thought I would conclude by She was not a big poetry fan, nor am I, but she had one favorite poem that she would tell me about. My mom had what we think may have been encephalitis when she was a senior in high school, and in delirium, she told me she would repeat this poem over and over again about the importance of us being everything that we can be, and you really being the only person that can make your life what it is. And that's a poem called Invictus by Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And that's kind of the credo my mom taught us to live by.
Thank you so much, Tom. Alex Frank, son to Bob and Ellen, speaking for himself and possibly for grandchildren, the other grandchildren, wants to share. Alex, sorry.
Thank you, Rabbi. And first, I'd like to say thank you to my cousins, especially also my brother, and especially Elise for allowing me to speak on behalf of the grandchildren here today. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I consider my special relationship to be with my grandmother. I'll start off by saying I was really close with my grandmother, especially after my grandfather died. But although I spent a lot of time with her when I was younger, I didn't take her as seriously as I should have before my grandfather died. I don't want to say it was a lack of respect. I always respected my grandmother, but I just didn't have that level of understanding that I would end up having as I grew older. Two examples of this come to mind. When I was a freshman in high school, we had a carpool with a couple of friends. And whenever it was our turn and my dad couldn't take us, which was rather often, either my grandfather or my grandmother would drive us. One of my friends in the carpool, his name was Raj Kasturi, was never ready when we came to pick him up. And it was one day I sat in the front seat and I said to no one in general, "Dude, Raj, hurry up." My grandmother, patient as always, as Raj came into the car, she chimed in, "Dude, Raj, nice to meet you." She thought his name was Dude Raj, and we still tell that story among friends today. Another example of me not taking her seriously enough was when I decided to teach her how to use the computer. Despite spending hours after hour going through the steps on how to turn on the computer, open up applications, files, etc., she was never able to grasp the virtual reality aspect of the computer, how to intuitively open up files as if they were in front of you on the table. I think a lot of you know what I mean, but she didn't get it no matter how patiently I tried. Besides pressing the on button just to see if it would turn on a few times, I don't think she ever touched the computer after I left for college. Those are just two of the many examples of me, I would say, writing off my grandmother as a helpless neophyte for a little while. Well, it took a while for me to realize that I couldn't have been more wrong, and I'll explain what I mean a little later. Despite my grandmother having helped raise me as a young child, both my parents worked, and I spent a lot of time with her, especially at her house. I can only remember her being mad at me twice. The first time was when I was riding my tricycle down Sulgrave Road. I zoomed down away from her down the hill, and in a panic, my grandmother ran to catch up with me, and she turned the trike around, scolded me when we got home. My punishment was that I wouldn't be able to watch my favorite TV show at the time, which was Shining Time Station, Thomas the Tank Engine. Needless to say, I didn't miss the episode that night. My grandmother just couldn't bear the sight of me being upset. The other time, or time she got angry with me as a teenager, is when I would come over to visit after my grandfather died. I would come over and visit, we'd eat dinner, I'd have a computer lesson or two, and my phone would be either ringing or beeping or vibrating, and she didn't like the fact that I wasn't giving her my undivided attention. But there was a backstory to this. When I was young, one thing I distinctly remember, and many of you can attest to this, is that my grandmother would have long phone conversations. The phone would ring. It would be a friend of hers that she had known since she was a little girl. And she would be on the phone for 30 minutes, an hour, however long. And she would spend a long time catching up on the phone with friends that she had known forever, or had just met, or people she didn't really care for, or family members, whoever. It would happen all the time. And she was polite to every single one of them, and she took the time to listen carefully and catch up with them all. And I never really complained about it. And normally I'd be watching football with my grandpa, or playing pool, or playing on the computer. But I did notice. It was more often than anyone that I had ever known. And flash forward to my late teens or early college, and I would have friends texting me or calling me constantly, just wondering what the plan was for later that evening, or who knows. I just got a lot of texts whenever I seemed to be sitting down with my grandmother. I would apologize, and she'd be a little annoyed, but she also knew it was important to keep a healthy social life. It was important to visit and spend time with friends, and I think I got a lot of that from her. I always admired how she never burned bridges. She kept in contact with friends and maintained a healthy social life. It was a big part of who she was, and it is now a big part of who I am. And when I was younger, before my teenage years, my grandmother would always be going to some sort of meeting, social gathering, book club, dinner club, whatever she went to, she would go to it rather often. She would talk about how she'd be having dinner with the same friends for 50 years, been in the same book club for 30 years. It all rubbed off on me. She would also try to introduce me as to many people as possible, including other kids on the street, grandkids of her friends, kids on the block, anyone. She liked connecting other people. And she especially liked to brag about me. And not just me, all of us, really. I bet my cousins don't know this, but I was always kept up to date with everything going on in their lives. From Elise's plays to Jacob's art and sports and girlfriends and Joseph's saxophone awards and Mimi's math test scores. She loved all of us, and she especially loved bragging about us to her friends and other family members. Anyway, she would always try to sell me to other girls my age that she would meet. She did such a good job, apparently, one time that I got a Facebook message from a girl I'd never met asking me to meet me because if I was half as cool as my grandmother made me out to be, that she'd like to go on a date. Well, now, I don't know if this girl was truly desperate or not, but whether my grandma was just that good at bragging about me. It didn't matter. I appreciated the fact that my grandmother was always looking out for me. But let me backtrack a moment and get to the point I'm really trying to make in this speech. After my grandfather died, I was truly, truly shocked at how well she took it. I thought she would be a mess. I was. From my perspective, and maybe this was misogynistic at the time, but I thought she was truly dependent on my grandfather. In many ways she was, like with electronics and things like that, but that was just on the surface. I never saw her cry after my grandpa died, but I knew she was hurting. She was stronger than anyone I've ever met, given the circumstances. And frankly, I was curious how she could be so strong, given the circumstances. I would learn a lot about this strength over the next few years, especially when we would go down to visit her sisters in Akron. Now that my grandfather wasn't around, she didn't have anyone to take her to see her sisters, Esther and Maxine in Akron. And I would often take her sometimes, but it was never enough for her. She would visit with them every single day if she could. In hindsight, that love for his siblings that she displayed wore off on me, as I've never felt closer to my own brother than I do now. She would end up bribing me with, well, we can stop at Swenson's and get at Hamburg. That's what she called it, Hamburgs. And those of you that know me, that's practically offering me a gold bar in exchange for a few hours in a car. More importantly, I did want to spend time with my grandmother, and I knew how much it really meant to her. It would take an hour each way to get there, and those who knew my grandmother well knew there wasn't a chance in hell we'd be listening to the radio on the way down. So we would have a good 2 hours each time to talk to her, We would learn more about each other and just really talk about life. One thing we would often talk about is how much she missed my grandfather. She was lonely. Now, I suppose many of you know this already, but one thing that struck me is that she knew that she would never see my grandfather again. She didn't believe in the afterlife in the normal sense of the world as most people do. She told me, I wish I could be like other people and have a sense of hope that I would see Tibby again, but I don't. I just don't. Now, to some people, this may seem depressing, but to her and I, it wasn't. It's hard to explain, but my grandfather's afterlife, to us, we both agreed, was the legacy and influence he left with us. The memories, all of it. To accept that, that's true strength. And my grandmother always considered herself to be Jewish. I really didn't understand it for a while. How can someone who doesn't believe in heaven, doesn't believe in God, consider themselves to be Jewish, or any religion for that matter? She would ask me, do you consider yourself to be Jewish? For a brief period of time, I didn't. Like her, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the afterlife, but she would remind me often about the time she asked a rabbi, I believe his name was Rabbi Green, must have been in the 50s or 60s. She asked if she could still be a Jew if she didn't believe in God. The rabbi replied, Audrey, you don't have to believe in God to be a Jew. You just can't be a Nazi. She told me that often. But she taught me, and slowly I realized that it was much more than just not being a Nazi. Obviously, that's an important part of it, but my grandmother taught me what it meant to be part of the tribe, at least in her eyes. It was Moses to Sandy Koufax, the long line of Jews who came before us and stuck together. It was everything that she ever taught me, everything that she embodied. Maintaining a good, healthy relationship with your family, learning about their interests. Even if it wasn't that important to you, it's important to them. It's about maintaining a healthy social life, getting out, mingling with like-minded people and breaking bread with them, sharing your life with them, learning about them, all of it. It's about meeting together as a family or with friends every Passover, holiday, etc., and sharing your life with them. The good, the bad, all of it. A true sense of togetherness, like her and my grandfather. Now, I will never see my grandmother again. I accept that. She knew it too. What helps me is knowing that she will always be with me. She will always be with all of us. A part of her is in every bone of my body. Every time I have to make a decision, I think about what Grandpa would do, or what my grandfather would do, or my grandmother would do. Her influence and imprint strikes me down to my deepest core. To her, heaven was not this place in the sky where you see everyone you've ever met. Heaven is the influence and imprint you leave on those that you love the most. She may not be here physically today, but she will be here. She will always be with us. You can't escape her no matter how hard you try. She's a part of every decision I make, every decision I will make, and every decision I won't make. I don't have to wait to die to see her again, because she will always be here. Always. Thank you.
Beautifully said, Alex. Thank you so much. Bob Frank, the oldest son. Bob.
Not bad for a poor girl from Akron. Mom would often say, and that's what she was, a poor girl from Akron. Actually, Mom was born in Pontiac, Michigan, and moved to Akron when she was 2. She was the third of 3 girls. More than once, she told me she always suspected she was her parents' little mistake, or at least their little surprise. Her Hungarian immigrant dad, Martin Weiss, worked occasionally for a family-related beer distributorship, but the reality was he never really made much money. He was my grandmother's second husband. Her first husband was a handsome political activist for the radical leftist union IWW, International Workers of the World, named Zoltan. I don't remember his last name. Do you know? Anybody know? Zoltan was killed in a bizarre accident in Detroit when a factory smokestack collapsed and fell on him. There has to be more to that story, and someday I may get a chance to research it. What? Was it a tornado? Sure. That's what they told us. We'll find out one day. My grandmother Frances came to this country under somewhat mysterious circumstances. As I understand it, she came in the company of a man who expected to marry her. Apparently, Grandma had other ideas. They didn't come through Ellis Island, but it came ashore in Boston, my mother believed. Mom always suspected her arrival wasn't entirely legal, and for that reason, Frances never wanted to leave the country. She did become a citizen, however. Mom remembered her dad as warm and kind, leaving the discipline to her mother. Around 1940, Martin got cancer, and after a short and painful illness, died, leaving my mom fatherless at age 13. My grandmother was strong and willing to provide discipline and guidance for 3 daughters. Mom, being the youngest, was lucky to have 2 older sisters, Maxine and Esther, to help look after her. Frances, now a middle-aged widow, struggled to make a living as a seamstress, making dresses and doing alterations for the wealthier Akronites who lived in the area. Mom said they could have lived cheaper in East or South Akron, but Frances felt it would be more advantageous to live in West Akron in the Highland Square area, adjacent to the more prosperous neighborhoods around Delia Street and Merriman Street, where her wealthier customers lived. Mom went to Portage Path School from kindergarten through 8th grade. I just want to mention also LeBron James went to Portage Path School at a much later time. For most of the time Mom remembered, they lived on Grand Avenue in a house they didn't own where they often struggled to pay the rent. They had close friends in the Moskowitz family, and when she began spending time at the Akron Jewish Center, she began a lifelong friendship with Sarah Liebenberg, who we all know as Sarah Felder. In the 9th grade, she went off to Buchtel High School. Anyone with eyes could see that Mom was a pretty girl, and she attracted the attention of lots of boys, none of whom were of any particular interest to her until her senior year, when a new boy came to school. His name was Tibby Frank, and he came from what must have seemed like the marvelously exotic and sophisticated land of Shaker Heights. What was he doing here? According to my mom, his arrival caused quite a stir, particularly with the Buchtel girls. The truth was, my dad came to Buchtel because his dad bought a bar, the Southern Tap Room, located right between the B.F. Goodrich factory and the Goodyear factory, where 3 shifts a day were pumping out tires and other rubber products for the wartime needs of the military. Bar was open every legal hour, from 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day but Sunday. According to my mom, Dad, who quickly made the football, wrestling, and track teams, started coming around the Weiss house, coming up with all kinds of reasons to stop by. Someone, either one of the sisters or maybe my grandmother, finally said, "Audrey, you need to either pay that boy some attention or tell him to go away for good." Mom decided to pay him attention, and at 17, they began a romance that spanned 4 years of courtship and 54 years of marriage until my father's death in 2002. Immediately after graduation, high school graduation in 1945, my father enlisted in the Navy. He used to tell me, "I figured I might still get killed, but at least I'd sleep in a warm bunk instead of a muddy foxhole." The reality was that his 19-year-old brother, Louis, had already been killed in the battle for Guam. Louis was a Marine, and Dad could have gotten out of serving under the sole surviving son rule, but felt he should do his part. The war in Europe was already over. The military was gearing up for the invasion of Japan, an effort that strategists estimated could cost up to 1 million lives. Dad's strategy was to go to school. He went to radio school, which he completed, then tried radar school, emulating his future brother-in-law Maury. But as a high school graduate, he didn't have the training and background to finish. Anyway, the atomic bomb solved that problem. And after only 6 months or so, Dad was discharged. I have a large box at home filled with letters, love letters, I suppose, that Dad wrote to Mom from the Navy. Let's be honest, for a World War II veteran, Dad was lucky. He never saw a ship, he never left the country. Someday when I get up the nerve, I'll go through those letters and read them. Mom saved them, but didn't let us look at them. After the Navy, Dad's new strategy was to go to school, take advantage of the GI Bill for which he was eligible. First undergrad at Western Reserve, then law school at Western Reserve School of Law, where, by the way, he finished 4th in his class. During that time, Mom worked at the only 2 paying jobs she ever had, as far as I know. First at Akron's American Hard Rubber, then after marriage and moving to Cleveland, at Grossman Music, which is still there. By the way, she was a secretary. Mom had attended Akron U for a short while, taking secretarial courses. She learned to type, and she learned Gregg shorthand, something that's pretty much a lost art these days. As a child, I would find notes around the house consisting of these strange markings that looked like something you'd find on the wall in some ancient tomb. That was Greg's shorthand. Mom's tuition at Akron University was paid for by her oldest sister, Esther. That's something Mom told me many times and never forgot. Mom and Dad were 10 days apart in age, and at 21 they married. People did not live together before marriage in those days, and as a newly married couple, they needed a place to live. Here's an interesting tidbit. In law school, during the 1948 election, Dad was heavily involved in the Progressive Party campaign of Henry Wallace, the former Roosevelt administration Secretary of Agriculture and Vice President. Full of proletarian idealism, Dad wanted him and Mom to move to the new public housing projects on Woodland Avenue. My grandmother Elsie was appalled. She persuaded my grandfather to build Dad and Mom a third-floor apartment, frankly what they call an illegal third, on the third-floor attic of their house on Daleford Road. By that time, my grandfather had sold the bar in Akron and had moved back to Cleveland, where for a short time he ran a hamburger joint called Willie's on Woodland Avenue, and then went into the entirely new business of washing cars along a conveyor chain. Dad continued law school, and Mom essentially supported them with her job at Grossman Music. He graduated. Again, he was fourth in his class, a large class. Worked for a very short while at Legal Aid, and then decided law wasn't for him. He'd go in with his father in the automatic car wash business. How did Mom feel about this? She hinted to me a few times she wasn't very pleased. After all, she'd worked to put her new husband through law school, and was counting on being the wife of a successful lawyer. And now her husband was working ridiculously long hours and coming home covered in dirt and grease instead of in a suit with a briefcase. Oh, and there was the batting range. My dad, his dad, and their partner Paul bought a batting range, the Al Rosen batting range on Northfield Road. Dad would work days in the car wash and then nights at the batting range. I'm not sure how much influence my mother had in this, but the batting range didn't last too long. And the illegal third over the parents' house wasn't the sort of thing that could last too long either. And my parents bought their first house, a small house on Delray Road in the Lee Harvard area. That's where they lived in 1953. That's where they lived when I was born. And we lived there until just around the time I turned 3. I still have some memories of that house, the street, and some of the kids who lived near us. In 1956, Dad was starting to do okay when it was time to move again. Here's another little tidbit. Dad was offered a fantastic deal on a magnificent mansion of a house on North Park Boulevard in Cleveland Heights, just over the Shaker Line and across from the lower Shaker Lake. $35,000. Mom took one look at it and said, "If you think I'm going to clean a house that size, you're out of your mind." Dad was disappointed, but Mom got her way, and for the same price, $35,000, they bought a small 3-bedroom house on Fairmount Boulevard. That's where I mostly grew up. Mom took being a housewife seriously. When I was small, I remember her only cooking a few things. There was just a few things she cooked over and over again. Year by year, she expanded her repertoire, became a pretty good and pretty versatile cook. 1959, my brother was born, and in 1961, my sister. My brother and I tried sharing a bedroom for a while, but it was difficult, there being a fairly large difference in our ages. So in 1964, we moved to Sulgrave Road, the last house they owned, where they continued to raise their family, enjoyed their grandchildren, and where my father eventually died in the first floor bedroom off the main hall. Then there was the boat. Around 1959, and I remember it as if it were yesterday, while I was playing in the driveway on Fairmount Boulevard, my dad came up to me and asked, "Bobby, what would you rather have, a trip to Disneyland or a boat?" I answered, "A boat." Dad said, "I hope you'd say that." And so he bought a 25-foot cabin cruiser he named the Gulliver after the Jonathan Swift character in the novel. The problem was, boats are for men of leisure, and my father was not a man of leisure. Taking off weekends was out of the question. Even on Sundays, my dad would work till 1 or 2 in the afternoon and then race home. Mom was expected to cook supper to eat on the boat, get us kids ready, and be prepared to drive an hour or so to where we kept the boat. See, my dad was not the sort to join a yacht club. So we kept the boat first at the Edgewater Marina downtown, then at a place called Mentor Lagoons, which was, to be blunt, a dump. It was like the backdrop to a cheap zombie movie. The creature from the Mentor Lagoons. Dad and I would spend the first hour or so and Mom cleaning the bugs, gunk, and dirt off the boat. Then we'd go out on the lake for an hour or so, and by then my brother and sister would be tired and we'd have to go home. And then my sister would usually cry in the car all the way home. She was one of these kids that cried constantly until she was 3 and then never cried again. My mom hated that boat. She never told my dad that, at least as far as I know. One day Dad took Tom and I out on the lake, and Dad tried to take the boat close to shore to show us where some people he knew lived. He hit a rock and bent the propeller shaft. That was the last day I ever saw the boat. Mom used to say the 2 best days in a man's life are the days he buys his boat and the day he sells it. I loved all 3 of my grandmothers. My dad's mom, Elsie, doted on me and worked hard to spoil me as rotten as she could. But my mom always felt a distance from her. She felt Elsie wanted Dad to marry better, someone more substantial than a poor girl from Akron. Mom did, however, develop a close bond with Elsie's mother, Vilma, my great-grandmother. I did too. We spent a lot of time together. She was my favorite babysitter. She'd put me to bed when Mom and Dad went out, and they went out every Saturday night. Then she'd come back up and get me. We'd watch, first we'd watch Lawrence Welk, then Perry Como. When I got a little older, I wanted to watch Gunsmoke, but we watched Perry Como. Vilma was, as they might say, was old school. Really old school. She was born in 1879. For those of you interested in the arc of history, in 1879, the President of the United States was Rutherford B. Hayes. It was 14 years after the end of the Civil War, 3 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn. Like I said, old school. She was a short, squat, tough woman who outlived her husband and both of her children. Much of my great-grandmother's life was spent working as a cook. She could cook Hungarian, she could cook anything. She made Hungarian pastries with names like Dedeje and Bobajka and Sjödege. Mom would spend hours coaxing Grandma to show her how to make these Hungarian dishes Dad and us kids loved. Some of which she did. Some of which were just impossible to translate. I remember the day, though, sitting at the kitchen table on Selgrave when Grandma slapped her hand down on the table and said, "I want Tibby make arrangement, I go in a home." Mom tried to talk her out of it, but Grandma was insistent. She knew it was her time. So my great-grandmother moved into Montefiore, then located on Mayfield Road. Back then, residents had roommates. Grandma lived with a sour old woman she called Mrs. Kamp. Her real name was Kam. She was one of those refugees who had lived out World War II in Shanghai. Mrs. Kamp called Grandma, Grandma. Grandma's move to Montefiore was the turning point for Mom. She decided to get involved. She'd done some volunteer work before for Women's American Ort, for the JFK campaign, and a few other things. But Montefiore became her calling. She started a current events discussion group, and we kids remember seeing her spending hours finding and clipping articles she thought the old folks would be interested in. She also became a great recruiter, and there has to be many of you who ended up volunteering at Montefiore because Mom got you to do it. Now, I don't think Mom related all that well to people my age at the time. That was not the case with older folks. She loved them, and they loved her. When you walked into Montefiore with Mom, it was like being in the entourage of a celebrity. Frank Sinatra or Elvis couldn't have gotten a better reception than Mom did when she walked through those doors. Make no mistake, Mom's first priority was always my dad, her second, her children. But Montefiore was her purpose. I was in my late teens by that time, and Mom and I didn't always see eye to eye on things. I guess that's one way to put it. You see, those were the years of the generation gap, when there was a kind of stress and tension between generations that thankfully doesn't seem to exist as much today. Looking back, I have to say I wasn't really a bad kid. I never got in trouble with the law or anything like that, but I was, as you might say, willful. Look, it was the 60s. People my age wanted to try and do new things. My mother was someone who never smoked a cigarette, never drank, and certainly never tried any form of drug. In fact, the very idea of wanting to artificially alter your consciousness in any way was something she found completely incomprehensible. It wasn't a matter of right or wrong with her. It was a matter of life is precious. There are enough people who want to hurt you. Why would you want to do something to yourself that would hurt you? So maybe that's why I never really got into any sort of trouble. I always had a bit of a sixth sense, an alarm that went off in my head that told me, things are getting out of hand here. It's time for you to go home. Where could that have come from? Had to come from Mom. Yeah. Here's another little tidbit. My third year of college was kind of a rough one for me. I had gone through a bad breakup, and I was living essentially alone in a rough part of Boston called Jamaica Plain. I was living pretty much on Campbell's chunky soup from cans. And one day I opened a can, poured it into a pan, looked at it, got nauseous, and threw it out. I guess I was depressed. I went on a 5-day fast. Then I called Mom and said, you got to teach me how to cook. Cook what? She asked. You know, the stuff I like, the Hungarian stuff. Mom sat down and wrote recipes out on 3x5 cards. I learned to cook, and I still have those cards. When I moved back to Cleveland in 1975, I moved into an apartment on Warrensville Heights. It was a nice enough apartment, but one of the other residents happened to be a pyromaniac. And after a series of fires, I told Mom I had to get out of there. Where do you want to live? She asked. I told her Shaker Square. She figured it would be easier for me to find a place with someone her age present. So Mom and I walked up and down Northmoreland Avenue, knocking on doors, ringing buzzers, asking for the supers until we found a great place. Next phase of my life was marriage and parenthood. I've already heard about the kind of grandparent Mom was. It would have been awful difficult for us without her. Ellen worked long, regular hours, and I worked crazy hours. We both had to go out of town a lot. Mom, who was always there for her children, was always there for her grandchildren. Just before she turned 80, Mom expressed an idea to see her mother's hometown, her village really, in Hungary. She'd been to Hungary in the 1970s with Dad, but they mainly saw Budapest and didn't get to see the part of Hungary where we actually came from. My grandmother Frances was from a small village in northeast Hungary called Keked. It was a spa town where in the summer the rabbis would load their congregations onto trains and travel to Keked in the Zemplin Mountains, this is part of the Carpathians, to take the waters. People would float around all day in warm water containing a lot of minerals, and that was supposed to be good for their health. My grandmother's father ran a seasonal restaurant at the spa and also served as the town bleeder with leeches and razor blades. Really. Mom remembered Grandma Frances telling her stories of the town castle where the old Dowager Duchess lived. It all sounded very old worldy and a little spooky. So we planned a trip. My sister Carolyn and her family would go along as well. Turned out the castle was still there and had become an inn. We'd stay at the castle. How's that for a turnaround? We made reservations and planned the trip. We'd get a hotel in Budapest, see the sights there, and then rent a car and drive to Keked and stay in the castle. But there's a hitch. A Hungarian film crew was going to rent out the castle for the week, and we were canceled. What to do? We called my cousin Tibor in Canada, who called the manager of the castle and, as they say, tore him a new one. Tibor straightened everything out. Now we would not only stay at the castle, we'd stay for free. Tibor said, just take him a bottle of scotch. That's how they do things there. Mom was great on this trip. She went along with everything we wanted to do. She was fun. We saw the sights, visited museums, and even got to spend some time with my then 95-year-old Aunt Muncie, Mom's last living relative in Hungary. Muncie was another tough old bird who'd lived out the war, first in a labor camp and then in one of the safe houses set up by the Swiss Karl Lutz. Her life after the war was just as difficult, with 2 developmentally disabled children and a crippled husband. Muncie took us to her apartment near Margaret Island, 1 room with a tiny kitchen and in 1 even tinier bedroom. What a different life for us in America. Now let me tell you about the subways in Budapest. They're deep, very deep, and you get there on long, really long escalators, only they're not like the escalators you find here in a mall or department store. They go about 4 times as fast. I was terrified Mom would step on and go whoosh, out into space, but she didn't. She was great. She got on there and hung on. Then we headed for Keked. Mom was nervous. What if they wouldn't let us stay there? What would we do? I told her I had a plan. Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Plan A was we'd stay at the castle as we'd hoped. Plan B was we'd go to Miskolc, the nearest city, and stay there. Plan C, we'd get back into the car and come right back here to the hotel in Budapest. That was good enough for her. I think it was also a real hallmark in our relationship. Mom always trusted Dad. What he said, she believed. Now she was trusting me. I was very proud of that. We stayed at the castle. Maybe not the fanciest part, but we stayed at the castle, and for free. We visited the spa, now closed and dried up, but we saw the building where her grandfather had his restaurant. Next, she wanted to see where her grandparents were buried. So we induced the hotel manager, who, thanks to my cousin, was a little afraid of us, to lead us to the cemetery. He got into his car and motioned for us to follow in ours. First, he took us to the main town cemetery. It was full of stones in the shape of crosses. No, I told him. Then he took us to another cemetery, more crosses. I decided to put my cards on the table. Nem Jido, I said, pointing to the ground. He nodded as if he understood. We got back into our cars and he led us out into the countryside. We drove into a wheat field, dead end. We backed out and drove into another wheat field, then found a dirt road that went about a mile or so to the base of a hill. The manager got out and pointed to the hill as if to say, you can climb up there if you want, I'm staying here. There's a wonderful photo in the collage that my niece Mimi put together of Mom, Ellen, and Hank climbing the hill to the cemetery. The graves were on a single row along the ridge of the hill. At one end were the earliest graves, the stones so old they were no longer readable. At the other end were 2 final stones, 2 more modern stones belonging to some family named Klein who died in 1939. Probably the last year any Jew from Keked died at home. The view from the hill was magnificent. There was a farm at the base of the hill with sheep, ducks, and other livestock. The fields were covered with yellow sunflowers. You could see for miles. The cemetery was neat and clean, and the grass was cut. Who was taking care of it? The farmer? Or was it someone who decided, after what we did to the Jews, the least we can do is take care of their cemetery? We found the most likely stones, and Hank took photos of them. You see, the writing was in Hebrew, and we don't read Hebrew. When we got home, Mom took the photos to Rabbi Chase. He identified this photo of Mom's grandmother's stone. For Mom, for me, and for all of us, it was the completion of a circle. From Keked, we went to Sartori-Uyhe, a somewhat larger city and the birthplace of my mom's father. On the way, Mom wanted to stop at Holohosen, which means mountain home, a factory store where they make and sell this fancy Hungarian china. We found the place, and Mom and Ellen went into the shop while Hank and I went out to explore the town. In the shop, Mom decided to pick out presents for all her friends. Mom ended up with a large box full of fancy china plates and other doodads. Walking out of the store, Mom turned to Ellen, who was carrying the box, and said, "So how are you going to get that into your luggage?" It was Ellen who first noticed a change in Mom, and it was after dinner at our house. "Something's not right with your mom." I said I didn't notice anything. "No," she said, "something's wrong, I'm telling you." I thought it couldn't be possible. And so soon after the passing of her beloved sister Maxine, who went through the same thing. And so our relationship changed again. You know, there's one thing about people with memory issues. The first thing Mom forgot was everything about me that irritated her. We became best pals. She enjoyed everything we did together, including a lot of things she didn't have patience for before. We'd have her over to the house. Of course, my brother did too. We'd go for long walks in the new Acacia Park across from Stone Garden. By the way, just a year ago, we were doing 2 miles together. Sometimes I'd just pick her up, and we'd go about running whatever errands I had to do. She just loved being out and being with me, and I loved being with her. I'd put the Frank Sinatra station on the XM radio, and she'd smile and hum along. "Is she still alive?" she'd ask. "No." "Oh, that's too bad." "What about my sisters?" I'd have to tell her that Maxine had passed, but that Esther was hale and hearty. A few minutes later, she'd ask again, and I'd tell her again, and it went on like that. It wasn't the same relationship as before. In some ways, it was better. No issues, no peccadillos, no irritations. It was just love, pure love. That's how I'll remember her. You know, Mom may not have liked everyone, but she liked almost everyone, and as a result, everyone liked her. As for my dad, the kids, the grandkids, we knew she loved us, and we loved her. Mom's gone. We know she's gone. But that love is still there. It always will be. Not bad for a poor girl from Akron.
Thank you so much, Bob, for such a beautiful, really history, memoir of Audrey. And we all cannot help loving her and appreciating all that was in her life. I'll ask the congregation to kindly rise for the traditional prayers. God, full of mercy, El malei rachamim, shochen bamromim, hamsei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina, bemalos kedoshim utahorim, kezora kiamazirim et nishmas, Audrey Frank, Bela Bas Mordechai Vefega, Shalcha Leolama, Began Eden Temenuchasa, Anabal Harachamim, Hastireha Beseta Kenafecha Leolamim, Vetitzrohor Betzrochaim, Es Nishmasa, Adonai, Adonai, Hunachlasa, Vesanuach Beshalama Mishkava, Venomar, Amen. And dear God, full of mercy and full of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure, to the pure soul of Audrey Frank. And dear God, Master of mercy, we beseech you, remember all the worthy and righteous deeds and loving deeds that she performed in the land of the living, and may her soul ever be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. May she be reunited with Tibby, and may she rest in peace. For those who are familiar, we now join in the Kaddish. The Kaddish is a very mystical prayer that somehow binds us to those we've lost. And the Kaddish is something that a mourner can do, rather than just standing or listening to the rabbi, so on. The Kaddish is a way we can acknowledge our love, acknowledge God's will. I'll lead in the Kaddish. Kindly join. Yit gadal, v'yit kadash, shemei rabah. Bi'alma divrach irute v'yamlech malchute. B'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agalav v'zman karev v'yamru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevorach le'olam yomei amaya. Yit borach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha baruchu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'nechamata. Damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Literally, may there be great peace and life for us and for all Israel and all mankind. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'yimru amen. Just briefly, the family tree, the oldest child first, Bob and Ellen Frank and their children, Alex and Hank. Dr. Tom and Wendy Frank and their children, Elise and Jacob. Dr. Carolyn and Dr. Paul Sachs of Boston and their children, Joseph and Mimi. Our service concludes. God bless one and all.